Is the basics of how to brew beer. We start with malted barley, and malted barley is just barley that's been germinated and then roasted. This is pale malt. Pale malt's roasted just to the point of not having any moisture in it. It's a very important malt though, because this is where you'll get all of your fermentable sugars, so you'll use this malt in every beer you make. And the malting process is just the wetting down that grain, letting it start to grow, and then drying it. And what that does is changes the proteins in that grain to starches. Now, crystal malt, this one tastes a little bit like grape nuts. It's got a sweetness to it. What's happening is you're roasting it at higher periods or higher temperatures at longer periods of time. Some of the starches in that grain change to sugars. So that's where you get the sweetness in that one. And the next one, chocolate malt. I'm not going to pose for you.
That's fine. No,
you're taking
it's a video.
Yeah. I've done that before.
No posing needed.
And I would have stood there all day. I was asking the lady, I was like, when are you going to take that picture? She goes, I'm doing a video. It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Then I ended up on YouTube. I ended up on YouTube for not doing anything stupid. That's just not like me. Anyway, chocolate malt tastes more like coffee than it does chocolate. It's got a roastiness to it. Black hat malt. Now, this one doesn't taste very good. I've eaten this one before. It's burnt malt. And the story behind it is one of the maltsters was drying a batch of grain and he fell asleep. When he woke up, the grain that he was drying was burnt, but grain was very expensive, so he had to brew a beer with that burnt grain, and his name was Guinness. So that just shows you, and that just shows you that sleeping on the job is good, And somebody was in here and they said, well, are you sure he didn't pass out? And I said, okay, passing out on the job is good too. I always figure if I'm going to get my picture taken, I'm going to look good. Now, we do a smoked porter here, and in order to get that smokiness into our beer, we take some of our grain to Taku smokeries, and we'll smoke that grain. Well, we have to pick a time when they're not smoking fish, and they've cleaned out their smokehouse, because you don't want fish oils in the beer. And we take over their smokehouse, we'll smoke the grain for 24 hours, dry it for 24 hours, and then do another batch. Now, a lot of people, when they try the smoked porter, they'll ask us if we use smoked salmon in our beer. We don't, but we use the same wood, alder wood, to smoke our grain with, and that's what they use to smoke salmon with, so that's where people get that idea. And most beers have a shelf life of 3 to 6 months. Our smoked porter has a shelf life of, we're just not sure yet, because we started saving a pallet of that beer from 1993 on. That 93 smoked porter, excellent beer, it's 16 years old now. And I had a gentleman in here a couple of years ago, he was asking me how that beer was aging, and at that time we had it up to 12 years, and I told him that. He asked me if I thought it would make it to 21 years, and I said we were happy with 5 to 7 years. We thought 12 years was pretty incredible for a beer, and I asked him why he wanted to know on the 21 years, and he said his granddaughter was born in the year 2000, so he bought a 12-pack of that 2000 smoked porter. He's saving that for when she turns 21, so then on her birthday, for her first beer, she can have a beer that was brewed the year she was born. Like, you wait till you're 21 to have your first beer, Of course, I waited, I did, but I was young in dog years. I was 3, But it's okay because I was a professional, so it's all right. Now, back to making beer. We'll start with the pale malt, and then we'll add these specialty malts. Now, these will dictate your color and your flavor. If you're doing a darker beer like stouts and porters, you'll use the chocolate and the black patent. Red-colored beers like amber use a lot of the crystal malt. Now, we'll take all that grain upstairs, and we run it through a mill We don't want to pulverize that grain. You don't want to make flour out of it, but you want to open up those kernels. So we run the grain through the mill, drop it down in the mash tun, and then mash tun will have hot water in it. We'll mix up the grain with the hot water. It'll come out kind of the consistency of oatmeal. And then we do a step infusion mashing where you raise your temperature up, let it rest, raise it up and let it rest. What we're doing is converting the starches in that grain to sugars. Now the malting process changed proteins to starches. In the mash tun, we're changing those starches to sugars. Once you get it up to that sugar level you want, you transfer it down to the water tun, and water means to separate. And that's what we're going to do in that vessel, is separate the liquid from the grain. That water tun has a false bottom with slits in the floor, and it works like a sieve. It'll keep the grain up top, but allows your liquids to flow through. So we pull the liquid from the bottom, set it back up on top until you get a good firm bed of grain going in there, and that liquid starts coming out clear. That liquid is called wort, W-O-R-T, and it's sugar water. We'll take that sugar water, add it to the kettle, that's the center vessel behind me, start boiling that wort, and that's when you start adding your hops. Hops are little cone-shaped flowers that are very aromatic, but they're also very, very bitter. Now, if you didn't use hops in your beer would be so sweet that you wouldn't be able to drink it. So you're using the hops to try to balance out that sweetness of the malt with the bitterness of the hops. Our amber uses less hops. That's why amber tastes so sweet. ESBs, IPAs, they'll use a lot of hops, so they're less sweet. Now, hop flowers like that, hops go stale real quick. When hops go stale, they start to smell like cheese or dirty gym socks, so they're not real pleasant. So what the processors do is crush those flowers, make pellets out of them. That way you can vacuum seal them and freeze them, and they stay fresher longer. Now when I brewed on this 10-barrel system, I love the smell of hops, so I'm thinking if hops smell good, they have to taste good. I was wrong. These don't taste good at all. I ate one of these chunks of hops. That bitterness was so intense, it took me 2 hours to get that bitterness out of my mouth. I was drinking water and spitting. I was cussing and spitting. Even cussing didn't help get the bitterness out of my mouth. And that was like 13 years ago, and I'm starting to get old, you know. My memory's starting to go on me. I'm starting to think, well, maybe they weren't as bitter as what I've been telling people. You know, maybe I've been lying to all of these people. So like 4 days ago, for research purposes, I ate another chunk of hops, and actually, my memory's good. These are still bitter. But also, I quit drinking over 17 years ago, and if you think about it, the only time you get hops in your diet is through beer. No food uses hops. I don't drink beer anymore. So I'm kind of thinking that maybe the reason I keep on eating hops is I'm hop deficient. Now, it could be, you know. Now, we do 3 additions of hops in our beer. We do one at the beginning of the boil, one halfway through the boil, and then one 10 minutes from the end of the boil. Those first 2 additions, they're for bitterness. The heat from that boiling liquid will pull the bitterness out of the hops and impart it into the liquid. That 10 minutes from the end of the boil, that addition of hops is just for aroma. They're not in there long enough to get your bitterness out. They just soak the flavor of the hops out. And once you're done adding all your hops to the kettle, you swirl that liquid. That causes a whirlpool, pushes your hops to the center, will pull that liquid out of the side, run it through a heat exchanger, because here's where you add your yeast. Yeast is a living organism. If you added that yeast to the boiling wort, it would kill it. But drop the temperature of the wort down too far, and your yeast stays dormant, wouldn't ferment your beer. So we transfer the wort with the yeast added into a fermenter. What happens in a fermenter is yeast eats sugar, and they produce alcohol, CO2, and more yeast. The whole brewing process is malting the grain changes proteins to starches. Mashing that grain changes those starches to sugars. Yeast change those sugars to alcohol and carbonation, which is your CO2, and that's how you make beer. Now, yeast is also kind of like a sourdough starter. The yeast that we used 2 weeks ago to ferment our beer with, either a brewer will be in here later today or early tomorrow. He'll go down to the tank farm hallway, pick some tanks that fermented well, harvest yeast from those tanks. We'll use that yeast as starter for next week's batches of beer. So we use that same strain of yeast over and over again. And the first full year that we're in operation, we produced 1,600 barrels of beer. Well, last year we produced 117,000 barrels. So we've grown quite a bit, but you know, it would only take Budweiser 8 hours to produce what it took us last year to make. But Budweiser's got breweries all over the country. This is our only brewery. And we sell our beer to Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, California, Nevada, Arizona, Alaska, and we just added Colorado about a year ago. So we're in 10 states right now. And by adding Colorado, now we have Utah completely surrounded, you know. but Utah's got some strange liquor laws there, and I'm looking at it in a positive sense. Now those people can drive any direction and get beer. So, any questions for me?